predator becomes prey in the Florida Everglades as hundreds of hunters descend on the Sunshine State to catch and kill as many Burmese pythons.
The trail camera had been sitting in the same spot for 11 days. Mounted to a cypress tree deep inside the Big Cypress National Preserve, it had recorded the ordinary rhythm of a Florida swamp, herons wading through shallow water, an alligator sliding silently off a mud bank, the occasional flash of a white-tailed deer moving through the sawgrass at dusk. Standard footage. Background noise from a troubled ecosystem trying to remember what it used to be. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late 2024, a field technician downloaded the memory card and plugged it into a laptop inside a research trailer. She scrolled through the timestamps the way you scroll through anything routine, expecting nothing. She got to the clip from 3 nights earlier and hit play. She watched it once. Then she called her supervisor into the room without saying why. He watched it once. Then he picked up his phone and called the lead researcher at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. Within 2 hours, 4 scientists were crowded around that laptop in a research trailer that was never designed to hold 4 people. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody was panicking. They were doing something that anyone who has spent time around scientists will tell you is the most unsettling thing a scientist can do. They were going completely quiet. What that footage contained, what it means for the Everglades, and why it raises more urgent questions than it answers is a story that starts not with a snake, but with a storm. To understand what is happening in Florida's swamps right now, you have to first understand what the Everglades actually is, because most people get this wrong from the very beginning. The popular image is a swamp, stagnant and murky and vaguely dangerous. The reality is something far more extraordinary. The Everglades is a slow-moving river of grass, a vast, shallow sheet of water crawling southward across the limestone platform of South Florida at a pace so gradual you could stand inside it and never know the water was moving at all. It stretches across roughly 1.5 million acres of subtropical wilderness. It filters drinking water for millions of Florida residents. It absorbs storm surge that would otherwise devastate coastal communities. It regulates local weather patterns across an entire region. Ecologists have estimated the total economic value of the services this ecosystem provides at more than $31 billion every single year. Not from tourism. Not from fishing licenses or park admission fees. From the actual biological work the system does, the water filtration, the flood control, the aquifer recharge, the carbon storage, the nursery habitat for fisheries that feed people up and down the eastern seaboard. And the life inside it before things went wrong was staggering in its complexity. Enormous flocks of wading birds, with storks, roseate spoonbills, snowy egrets, would gather in numbers large enough to darken the sky above the sawgrass prairies. Alligators patrolled every channel and waterway with the unhurried authority of animals that had been doing this for 60 million years. Raccoons, bobcats, white-tailed deer, marsh rabbits, possums, and dozens of snake and reptile species moved through an intricate, layered food web that had been operating continuously since before any human civilization existed in North America. This system had been fine-tuning itself for thousands of years. Every species in it was shaped by every other species in it. Predators and prey locked in an evolutionary arms race so old that neither side had ever stopped running. Then Hurricane Andrew made landfall in August of 1992 as a Category 5 storm, and the arms race acquired a new competitor that none of the existing players had ever seen before. The winds from Andrew reached sustained speeds of over 165 miles per hour when the storm crossed the southern tip of Florida. Entire neighborhoods were erased in under an hour. Among the structures destroyed was a reptile breeding facility operating near Miami. When the winds finally quieted and the assessment of damage began, an unknown number of Burmese pythons had escaped into the surrounding wetlands and disappeared into the grass. That detail, the breeding facility, the escaped snakes, entered the public narrative about the Florida python crisis almost immediately. It became the origin story people told. But here is the part of that story that gets less attention. The hurricane was not the main driver of what came next. It may not have even been the most significant driver. Throughout the 1990s, Burmese pythons were selling at reptile expos across the country for as little as $10 each. They were marketed as exotic pets, manageable, impressive, a way to own something genuinely wild. And when a hatchling python fits in the palm of your hand, that pitch is easy to believe. What the pitch left out was the 10-foot, 60-pound animal the hatchling was going to become within a few years, and what an overwhelmed owner in a suburban house was supposed to do with that animal when the novelty wore off and the grocery bill for feeding it did not. Thousands of people made the same decision. They drove to the edge of the Everglades, opened a bag, and told themselves they were setting the animal free. They were not setting anything free. They were releasing a precision-engineered apex predator into the most biologically vulnerable large ecosystem in North America, an ecosystem whose native species had spent thousands of years evolving in the complete absence of a large, constricting predator capable of holding its breath underwater for 30 minutes, detecting body heat in total darkness, and remaining motionless for hours in terrain that makes it effectively invisible. The Burmese python is not just a large snake. It is a sensory system attached to a muscle with no structural weaknesses that an Everglades animal would know how to exploit. Heat-sensing pits along the jaw detect the thermal signature of warm, indistinguishable from dead sawgrass and muddy water in every lighting condition. A raccoon moving through the dark on a path it has used 1,000 times has no warm-blooded prey from several feet away. Scales patterned in brown and tan become running. It is simply there, and then it is not. A female Burmese python lays up to 100 eggs per clutch. In Florida, with no natural predators and an effectively unlimited food supply, the population did not grow gradually. It exploded. Current estimates from wildlife biologists and state wildlife management agencies put the Burmese python population somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 animals distributed across South Florida. The honest answer is that no one knows exactly, because accurately surveying a cold-blooded ambush predator across 1.5 million acres of dense subtropical vegetation is a problem that has not been solved despite years of serious attempts to solve it. What scientists do know is what the pythons did to everything else. A landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined mammal populations in areas of the Everglades with the longest documented python presence and compared them to areas where pythons had not yet reached. The numbers it produced are among the most dramatic population collapse figures ever recorded for a mammal community impacted by an invasive species. Raccoon populations in the hardest-hit zones had declined by more than 99%. Opossum populations had fallen by nearly 99%. Bobcat populations were down by nearly 90%. Marsh rabbits and foxes had in certain survey zones effectively ceased to exist, not reduced, not struggling, but functionally absent from areas where they had previously been common. Biologists who had spent decades working in the Everglades described walking or driving for miles through habitat they knew intimately, habitat that used to be dense with animal movement, and finding nothing. No rustle in the underbrush. No animals crossing the road in headlights. No birdsong in the early morning where the birds that depended on those mammals for ecological relationship had also begun to thin out. They called it the silence. Several researchers used exactly that word independently of each other. The silence of a place that used to be loud. The silence of a food web with its foundation eaten out from underneath it. Florida's response to this crisis moved through several phases. The public-facing version, the Florida Python Challenge, invited amateur hunters to wade into the Everglades and compete for cash prizes. It generated media coverage and genuine public enthusiasm. It did not make a meaningful dent in the python population. By the time the challenge had run through multiple annual cycles, the cumulative removal number relative to estimated population size was so small it barely registered as a rounding error in any population model. Professional removal programs were more effective. Since the state began paying experienced hunters to work the Everglades full-time, more than 23,000 pythons have been removed. That number sounds large until you place it beside an estimated population floor of 100,000 animals, at which point it becomes clear that removal alone, even professional, well-funded, systematic removal, is not capable of driving the python population down to levels where the ecosystem begins to recover. Thermal drones, designed to detect the heat signatures of large animals from the air, ran into a fundamental biological problem. Pythons are ectothermic. Their body temperature matches their surroundings. In an already warm Florida landscape, they are functionally invisible to thermal imaging. Mechanical decoy prey fail because ambush predators do not chase things that run. They wait for things to walk past. And then, in a development that field researchers documented across multiple field seasons, and that reframed everything the wildlife management community thought it understood about the scope of the problem, the pythons began to change their behavior. Traps that had been productive at specific sites stopped producing results. Hunters returning to areas where they had previously found snakes regularly found nothing. Analysis by Dr. Ian Bertashek and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida showed the change was not random. Across multiple field seasons, python movement patterns were consistently shifting away from the levees and access roads where human activity was concentrated into interior swamp terrain that was dramatically more difficult and dangerous for field teams to work in. Whether individual pythons were learning to associate human presence with danger, or whether natural selection was progressively eliminating the bolder, less cautious animals from the breeding population and leaving only the wariest to reproduce, the outcome was the same either way. A predator that was already nearly impossible to find was developing a measurable behavioral tendency toward becoming harder to find. The ecosystem had been in collapse. The instrument of that collapse was adapting to human intervention. While field researchers were watching python numbers hold steady against removal efforts, something was moving through the swamp that none of the population models had accounted for. It was microscopic. It had arrived with the pythons. And when it finally came to the attention of wildlife health researchers, it forced a fundamental revision of how badly the Everglades was actually damaged. Raleigh orientalis is a parasitic pentastomid, a lungworm, native to Southeast Asia. Burmese pythons carry it, but Burmese pythons have coexisted with it across an evolutionary timescale long enough to develop biological tolerance. For a Burmese python in Florida, Raleigh orientalis is a manageable passenger. For a native Florida snake species that has never encountered it before, the organism is something else entirely. Dr. Christina Ramagosa, a research scientist at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, encountered the parasite during routine health assessments of native Florida snake species. The animals she was examining, garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, species that should have been healthy and common, were emaciated and weak, moving with the slow and labored deliberateness of animals struggling to breathe against some internal resistance. When she conducted post-mortem examinations, she found the source. The lungs of infected snakes were packed with a parasite, burrowed into tissue, blocking airways, feeding on the biological material of the host. By her own account, she needed a moment to step back from the examination table before she could continue working. The transmission chain for this parasite is one of the more methodically disturbing processes documented in contemporary wildlife biology. An infected python deposits waste in swamp water. Cockroaches consume that waste and ingest larval parasites in the process. A frog eats an infected cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. Inside the native snake, the larvae do not remain in the digestive system. They penetrate the stomach wall, migrate through the body cavity, and travel directly to the lungs, where they attach, feed, and multiply. As the infection progresses and the lung tissue becomes increasingly compromised, the snake weakens, loses the ability to feed, and eventually suffocates. Field teams have documented snakes in the late stages of severe infection, with adult parasites visible in their mouths as they died. When researchers mapped the documented spread of Raleigh orientalis across Florida, what they found extinguished whatever optimism might have remained about a straightforward biological solution to the python problem. The parasite had already spread well beyond the Everglades. At least 18 native snake species were documented as infected hosts. Cases have been confirmed as far north as Jacksonville. And the single most alarming finding in the entire dataset, the parasite no longer required the Burmese python for transmission. It had successfully established independent transmission cycles within native snake populations. It was now spreading snake to snake through the established cockroach-frog-snake pathway, with no Burmese python necessary anywhere in the chain. Even a hypothetical scenario in which every Burmese python in Florida was removed tomorrow would not eliminate Raleigh orientalis from the state. The secondary invasion had achieved its own momentum. The food web of the Everglades was therefore under simultaneous assault from two directions. From above, the pythons were consuming the mammal community that formed the base of the system. From within, the lungworm was dismantling the reptile community that occupied the middle of that system. Two disasters, biologically independent in origin, but functionally accelerating each other's impact. Inside that landscape of compounding catastrophe, Dr. Ramagosa's team found something that none of the existing models predicted, and that cut through the accumulated despair of 2 decades of collapsed data like something sharp and unexpected. Across multiple survey sites and multiple field seasons, in habitat where Raleigh orientalis had been confirmed in every other snake species examined, the Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper native to the same wetland environments where the lungworm was most concentrated, was coming back clean. Zero infection. No respiratory distress. No parasites in post-mortem lung tissue. Just healthy animals moving through heavily contaminated habitat as though the parasite did not exist. No one had an explanation. The cottonmouth's immunity, if immunity is even the correct word for something whose mechanism remains entirely undescribed, did not fit any framework the research team had ready access to. Whether the answer lay in some property of the cottonmouth's immune system, in its blood chemistry, in some component of its venom that created a hostile internal environment for the parasite, or in something else altogether, nobody knew. What they did know was that one native species had developed or retained some biological characteristic that rendered it resistant to a parasite that was killing every other snake species researchers were examining. That characteristic, whatever it was, existed somewhere in the cottonmouth's biology. And if it could be identified, characterized, and understood, the implications for managing the lungworm crisis extended far beyond the cottonmouth itself. Scientists working the Florida reptile health crisis identified this as the most urgent unanswered question in their field. The cottonmouth was not a solution. It was a clue. And at the moment that clue was filed under urgent and unresolved, a different set of researchers working several hundred miles to the north announced a development that the conservation biology community had spent 50 years working toward and had begun, quietly and without saying so officially, to doubt would ever actually arrive. The eastern indigo snake is the largest native snake in North America by length, reaching documented sizes of nearly 9 feet in exceptional individuals. Its scales carry an iridescent blue-black sheen that catches available light with an almost metallic quality. It is completely immune to the venom of every pit viper native to North America, cottonmouths, timber rattlesnakes, eastern diamondbacks, copperheads. It eats them all without consequence, pinning prey with powerful jaws and swallowing it alive rather than constricting it. It is the apex predator of the forest floor. Or it was before human development removed the habitat feature it could not survive without. Eastern indigo snakes depend on gopher tortoise burrows for thermal regulation, for shelter from the extreme heat of Florida summers and the cold snaps of winter that would otherwise be lethal. As development consumed the longleaf pine forests and sandhill scrub habitats of North Florida through the mid-20th century, gopher tortoise populations collapsed under habitat loss. The indigo, without the burrows, could not maintain viable populations. By 1978, eastern indigo snakes were functionally absent from North Florida. The species was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And there it remained for decades, officially recognized as threatened, practically regarded in conservation circles as one of the most difficult large native reptile recovery challenges in the Southeast. The work to reverse that outcome was slow, unglamorous, and largely invisible to public attention. Conservation organizations established captive breeding programs. Habitat restoration efforts slowly rebuilt patches of longleaf pine forest. Gopher tortoises were reintroduced to prepared sites to reconstruct the underground infrastructure the indigo required. The Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle became one of the primary release sites. Animals were released. Some were tracked and survived. Some disappeared from monitoring data and were presumed dead. The project continued for years without producing the result that would confirm it had actually worked. The result that would confirm it had actually worked was a wild-born hatchling. Not a released animal. Not a captive-bred snake placed in prepared habitat. A snake that hatched from an egg laid in the wild by a female that had survived and established herself well enough to reproduce. In late 2023, a trail camera at the Apalachicola Preserve captured footage of 2 small eastern indigo hatchlings moving through the underbrush, animals that had never been in a captive facility, never been handled by a researcher, never been anything other than wild. Dr. Kevin Inge, herpetologist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and one of the lead scientists managing the reintroduction program, was among the first to review that footage. He had spent years releasing animals into this landscape, watching some thrive and some vanish. He watched the clip twice. Then he called his colleagues. By his own account, his hands were not entirely steady when he picked up the phone. The eastern indigo snake was reproducing in the wild in North Florida for the first time in approximately 50 years. The king of the forest floor was building a population on its own terms, in wild habitat, without human intervention sustaining it. While that was happening in the north, something was changing in the south that nobody had included in any model of how this crisis would develop, because nobody had thought to model it. The conventional understanding of the Everglades python crisis, as it hardened into received wisdom over 20 years of research and reporting, was essentially a story of permanent victimhood. The pythons were the invaders. The native wildlife was the victim. The food chain moved in one direction, downward, and native animals could not adapt to a predator they had no evolutionary experience with. That story was accurate for most of the period it described. And then it started to become incomplete. Dr. Bertashek's team was tracking a large Burmese python through the Big Cypress National Preserve using a surgically implanted transmitter, standard field work for a research program that had been running for years. When the team followed the transmitter signal to its location, they found the python dead. Its head had been removed. A nearby trail camera had recorded what happened. A bobcat, a native Florida bobcat weighing somewhere around 25 pounds, roughly half the mass of the snake it killed, had identified an opportunity, positioned itself correctly, attacked at a precise angle, and won. Dr. Bertashek reviewed the footage and, according to colleagues who were present, went quiet for several seconds before speaking. What he said was that they needed to pull every other camera in the area immediately. It was not an isolated incident. Reports from multiple locations across South Florida documented similar events. Florida alligators were ambushing smaller pythons during water crossings, using the environmental context that gave the alligator its own advantages. A Florida panther was captured on camera, killing a mid-sized python in the sawgrass. Across multiple native predator species, field researchers were documenting what appeared to be a learned behavioral shift, native animals identifying and exploiting specific vulnerabilities in python behavior. The python's sluggishness in the period immediately after consuming a large meal. The brief exposure during water crossings. The moments of reduced alertness that even a near-perfect ambush predator occasionally enters. This is not a recovery. The distinction matters enormously, and the researchers studying this change are careful to maintain it. The python population remains far too large, and the mammal collapse it caused far too severe for individual predation events by native animals to constitute a meaningful reversal. What has changed is the character of the dynamic. For 20 years, the relationship between Burmese pythons and native Everglades predators was not a competition. It was a unilateral consumption. Now, for the first time, it is something more complicated than that. Native animals are dying, but some of them are also winning individual encounters against an animal that for 2 decades appear to have no natural check on its behavior in this landscape. Wars do not turn on the aggregate. They turn on moments. And the moment in which a 25-pound bobcat identifies and exploits a structural vulnerability in a 50-pound apex predator is not a statistic. It is a behavioral data point that gets transmitted through observation, through survival, through whatever mechanism. Animal learning operates across to every other bobcat in proximity to the same conditions. Which brings everything back to the footage from the trail camera in the Big Cypress National Preserve and to the question that left 4 scientists standing in a research trailer in complete silence. The eastern indigo snake population expanding southward out of North Florida, and the Burmese python population extending northward along warming temperatures and connected waterways are on a collision course that wildlife biologists can see coming in the data but cannot precisely locate in space or time. These 2 ranges are going to intersect. The indigo is an Ophiophagus, a snake-eating snake whose entire predatory biology is oriented toward hunting and consuming other snakes. It is immune to venom. It is fast, aggressive, and equipped with jaws strong enough to grip prey it cannot constrict. It has taken down eastern diamondback rattlesnakes. It has consumed cottonmouths. It has never encountered a Burmese python. No one has ever documented that encounter. And no one knows with any confidence how it resolves. What the research community does know, and what turns the indigo's return from an unambiguous triumph into something far more complicated, is that the lungworm's documented spread is moving north along the same geographic corridor the indigo is moving south through. Raeliatiella orientalis has already reached Jacksonville. The Indigo Recovery Project's current footprint extends through the Florida Panhandle. The 2 are not yet in contact. But the window in which researchers need to characterize the indigo's susceptibility to the parasite and to develop some intervention capable of protecting expanding wild populations if susceptibility is confirmed is not an indefinitely open window. It is narrowing. 50 years of painstaking conservation work, the captive breeding, the habitat restoration, the gopher-tortoise reintroduction, the patient and mostly invisible accumulation of the ecological conditions the indigo needed before it could come back. All of it arrived at the moment of its first genuine wild success and found itself facing a biological threat that none of the project's original design had accounted for. The cottonmouth's unexplained resistance to that same parasite may be the most important piece of undescribed biology in Florida wildlife research right now. If the mechanism can be characterized before the indigo's expanding range intersects with the lungworm's documented spread zone, it might be possible to do something with that knowledge. What exactly might be possible? Prophylactic treatment, captive exposure trials, selective breeding for resistance characteristics remains in the territory of scientific possibility rather than practical protocol. The clock on that possibility is running. What the footage from Florida's swamps reveals is not what anyone went looking for, because no one predicted there was anything to find that didn't fit the established narrative of slow, expensive, and largely unsuccessful human intervention against a biological problem that had grown larger than the tools available to address it. What it reveals is that the Everglades, which is not a swamp but a slow-moving river of grass that took thousands of years to become what it was, is not behaving like a system in terminal decline. It is behaving like a system under extreme pressure that is finding, through the collision of forces nobody engineered and nobody planned, something that the ecological literature sometimes calls a new equilibrium and sometimes refuses to name at all, because naming it implies a resolution that hasn't arrived. The pythons are still winning on the metric that matters most, which is population size relative to removal pressure. The lungworm has achieved biological independence from the animal that introduced it. The bobcats are learning something that their grandparents did not know. The eastern indigo is reproducing wild for the first time in 50 years. The cottonmouth is carrying an unexplained answer to a question that could save or doom the recovery of the one animal position to change the entire predator dynamic in the southern Everglades. And somewhere in the Big Cypress National Preserve, a trail camera is running in the dark, pointed at a crossing where two ranges are slowly, inevitably closing the distance between them. Nobody in that research trailer was celebrating what the footage showed. Nobody was panicking either. They were asking a question that 20 years of field research, thermal drones, professional hunters, captive breeding programs, parasite surveys, and millions of dollars in wildlife management funding had not yet produced an answer to. What happens next? The swamp doesn't answer questions. It just keeps moving south 1 inch per day, the way it always has, carrying everything it contains toward the ocean, carrying the pythons, the parasites, the returning kings, the learning predators, and the silent open question of what a broken ecosystem becomes when it starts, against all reasonable expectation, to fight back.